1945 Germany. When female German POWs arrived at American camps, they braced for the brutality their propaganda had promised, but instead, young American soldiers offered them chocolate, threw ice cream socials, and treated them with a respect they'd never known under the Reich. But what happened when these forbidden romances collided with a devastated homeland that would call them traitors for falling in love with the enemy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1945, Germany was dying. The war everyone thought they would win had turned into a nightmare that swallowed everything. Cities that once stood proud now looked like mountains of broken stone and twisted metal. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, all of them were just piles of rubble where buildings used to be. The air smelled like smoke and dust, a smell that never went away no matter how much time passed. Food had become more precious than gold. German families lived on tiny portions that could fit in a child's hand. A slice of black bread, a small potato, maybe some watery soup if they were lucky. The ration cards the government gave out promised 1,000 calories a day, but most people got far less than that. Mothers watched their children grow thin and hollow-eyed. Old people simply sat down one day and never got up again. The Reich that promised to last 1,000 years couldn't even feed its people for 12 money, meant nothing anymore. The Reichsmark bills that once bought groceries now served better as kindling for fires. People traded whatever they had, a silver spoon, a wool coat, a family heirloom, just for a few eggs or a bit of butter. The black market ruled everything. If you wanted to survive, you learned to trade and barter like your life depended on it, because it did. The war had taken most of the men. Fathers, brothers, sons, husbands gone to the Eastern Front, the Western Front, North Africa, everywhere Hitler's armies marched. Many never came back. The ones who did return often came back broken, missing arms or legs or something deeper inside that no doctor could fix. Women now made up 6 out of every 10 people left in Germany. They ran the factories, cleared the rubble, searched for food, and tried to hold their families together with nothing but willpower and prayer. Among these women were 3 who would soon learn that everything they believed was a lie. Greta had worked as a communications operator for the Wehrmacht, sitting at radio equipment in a concrete bunker, passing messages between officers. She came from a middle-class family in Munich where her father had been a schoolteacher before the war. Helga had served as a nurse near the front lines, holding the hands of dying boys who called for their mothers with their last breaths. She was only 23 but looked 10 years older. And there was Anneliese, just 19, who had joined the Women's Auxiliary because the posters made it look exciting and important. A way to serve the fatherland. All 3 had grown up under Nazi rule. They remembered the rallies, the flags, the speeches that made them feel part of something grand and historic. They had been taught that Germans were special, chosen, destined to rule. They had been told that their enemies were monsters, that the Russians were savages, that the British were weak, that the Americans were soft gangsters who knew nothing about real sacrifice or real strength. As the Allied armies closed in from all sides in April 1945, these women found themselves retreating with what was left of their units. The end came quickly. One moment they were following orders. The next moment American soldiers appeared with their rifles raised, shouting words in English that sounded harsh and frightening. Greta, Helga, and Anneliese put their hands up like everyone else. Their hearts pounded so hard they thought they might die right there. The fear that gripped them came from years of propaganda. Dr. Goebbels had filled their heads with terrible images of what American soldiers would do to capture German women. They expected violence. They expected cruelty. They expected the worst things human beings could do to other human beings. As they stood there with their hands raised, waiting for whatever came next, Annalise started to cry silently, tears running down her dirty face. But what happened next made no sense at all. The American soldier who approached them was young, maybe 25, with a face that looked kind despite the mud and exhaustion of battle. He lowered his rifle and said something in English they didn't understand, but his tone wasn't angry. He gestured for them to follow him. Another soldier, this one with red hair and freckles, pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered them a round. Helga took one with shaking hands, expecting it to be some kind of trick, but it was real tobacco. Better than anything she had smoked in years. Then came something even stranger. The red-haired soldier reached into his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar. A real chocolate bar, wrapped in brown paper with English words on it. He broke it into pieces and handed them out to the German women standing there in their worn-out uniforms. Greta put the chocolate in her mouth and almost cried, because she hadn't tasted anything so sweet in 3 years. Why were these American soldiers being nice to them? What did they want? Nothing in all their training, all their education, all their propaganda had prepared them for enemy. Soldiers who offered chocolate instead of punishment. They were loaded onto trucks that were cleaner and better maintained than any German military vehicles they had seen in the last 2 years of the war. The American soldiers didn't push them or yell at them. They just pointed to the trucks and waited patiently. As the trucks drove through the countryside, the women sat in silence, trying to understand what was happening. Every instinct told them that the cruelty would come later, that this kindness was just a trap. But as the miles passed and nothing terrible happened, a tiny seed of doubt began to grow in their minds. Maybe, just maybe, everything they had been told was wrong. The POW camp sat in the French countryside, surrounded by wire fences but looking nothing like the harsh prison camps the women had imagined. When the trucks pulled through the gates, Greta saw rows of wooden barracks that looked sturdy and well-built. There were actual streets between the buildings, not just mud paths. American soldiers walked around looking relaxed, some of them smoking, others playing catch with a baseball. One of them waved at the arriving truck like they were visitors, not prisoners. The women were led to a processing building where they expected the worst. Instead, they were registered by a female American officer who spoke broken German and smiled while she wrote down their names. Then they were taken to a shower facility that made Helga gasp out loud. The building had real plumbing with hot water that came out strong and steady when you turned the handles. They hadn't seen hot running water in over a year. The soap they were given smelled like flowers, not the harsh lye soap they had used back home when they could get soap at all. Annalise stood under the hot water for so long that the other women had to tell her to hurry up, but she didn't want to leave. It felt like washing away years of dirt and fear and exhaustion all at once. After the showers, they were given clean clothes that actually fit. Not fancy clothes, just simple shirts and pants, but they were whole with no holes or patches. Then came the first meal. The women walked into a dining hall that looked bigger than any mess hall they had ever seen in the German military. The smell hit them first: real food cooking, meat and bread, and something sweet they couldn't identify. They got in line with metal trays, still not quite believing what was happening. The American soldier serving food piled potatoes onto Greta's tray, then added meat, then vegetables, then a piece of white bread with real butter. She stared at the portions. This was more food than her family back in Munich would see in a week. When she looked up at the soldier, he smiled and said something in English, then added even more potatoes. Helga started crying right there in the food line because the white bread reminded her of her childhood before the war. Before everything turned gray and hard and hungry, they sat at long tables and ate slowly, afraid that eating too fast would make them sick after so long with so little food. The bread was soft and fresh, not the dense black bread made from sawdust and whatever else that German bakers could find. The coffee was real coffee, not the bitter substitute made from roasted acorns. Some of the women couldn't finish their plates because their stomachs had shrunk, but no one took the food away. They could save it for later if they wanted. Over the next few weeks, the contrasts kept coming, each one hitting harder than the last. The camp had a medical building where American doctors treated German prisoners the same way they treated American soldiers. When Annalise got a bad cough, a doctor examined her, gave her real medicine, and told her to rest through a translator. Back home, medicine had run out 2 years ago. People just got sick and either recovered or didn't. The women were assigned work details, but nothing like the forced labor they had witnessed in German camps. They worked in the laundry or helped in the kitchen, and they got breaks. Actual breaks where they could sit down and rest. They got safety equipment if the work was dangerous. The American officers checked to make sure no one was being overworked or mistreated. It felt upside down and backwards from everything they knew about how prisoners should be treated. Then one Saturday afternoon in June, something happened that changed everything. The camp loudspeakers announced a special event in the recreation yard. When the women arrived, they saw tables set up with white clothes on them. American soldiers were setting out bowls of something cold and white that the women didn't recognize. One of the translators explained it was ice cream, a frozen sweet cream that Americans love to eat. Most of the German women had never tasted ice cream in their lives. Sugar had been rationed since before the war started. The Americans served the ice cream in little bowls with spoons, and they had different flavors: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. Greta took a bite, and the cold sweetness exploded in her mouth. It was so rich and creamy and impossible. How could these Americans have enough milk and sugar and cream to freeze it into dessert and give it away to prisoners? Back in Germany, children were drinking watered-down milk when they could get it at all. And here the Americans were making frozen treats like it was nothing special. Music started playing from the loudspeakers. American jazz and swing that sounded happy and alive. Some of the younger American soldiers asked the German women to dance. At first, no one moved. It felt wrong somehow, dangerous even. But then one brave woman said yes, and soon others followed. Helga found herself dancing with a tall soldier from somewhere called Texas, who had kind eyes and kept trying to make her laugh with his terrible German. He treated her like a normal person, like a woman at a dance. Not like an enemy or a prisoner. That night, lying in her bunk with a full stomach and clean clothes, and the memory of ice cream still sweet on her tongue, Greta felt something crack deep inside her chest. Her family back home was starving. Her mother was probably digging through rubble, looking for anything to sell or trade. Her little brother was growing up knowing only hunger and fear. And here she was, a prisoner of war, eating better than she had in 5 years, being treated with more kindness than her own government had ever shown its people. The propaganda had told them that Germans were superior, that they were the strong ones, the chosen ones. But if that was true, why were the Americans the ones with plenty? Why did the defeated prisoners eat better than the victorious soldiers had? Why did the enemy show more humanity than the fatherland? These questions kept her awake long into the night. And she knew she wasn't the only one asking them. The breaking point came on Christmas Day, 1945. The war had been over for 7 months. But the women were still in the camp waiting for arrangements to send them home. Germany was in chaos, divided into zones controlled by different countries, and sending people back took time and paperwork. The women had grown used to their strange life as prisoners who ate better than most free people in Europe. The Americans had been preparing something special for weeks. The women saw soldiers carrying in boxes and heard hammering and activity in the main dining hall. On Christmas morning, when they entered the hall, they stopped in their tracks and stared. The room had been decorated with colored paper chains and a real Christmas tree that reached almost to the ceiling. The tree had lights on it that glowed warm and bright, powered by electricity that never seemed to run out in this place. Tables were covered in white cloth and set with real plates and silverware that gleamed under the lights. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was the food that made Helga put her hand over her mouth to hold back a sob. There were whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and bigger than anything she had seen. There were bowls of mashed potatoes with rivers of gravy, plates of vegetables cooked with butter, baskets overflowing with rolls and bread, dishes of cranberry sauce that looked like red jewels. There were pies, apple and pumpkin and cherry lined up on a side table like sweet soldiers. The smell filled the entire hall. Rich and warm and impossible. An American chaplain said a prayer in English that the translator repeated in German. He thanked God for peace and asked for blessings on everyone in the room, German and American alike. Then the American commander stood up and said through the translator that on this day, there were no prisoners and no guards, only people sharing a meal together. He invited the German women to eat as much as they wanted. To celebrate that the war was over and they were all still alive, Greta sat next to a young soldier named Jimmy who came from a place called Iowa. As they ate, he pulled out a small photo album from his pocket and showed her pictures of his family's farm. The photo showed a white house with a porch, a big red barn, fields that stretched to the horizon, cows and pigs and chickens everywhere. His mother stood in front of a garden full of vegetables. His father sat on a tractor that looked new and powerful. There was a car parked in front of the house, and Jimmy said it belonged to his family, that they owned it. Jimmy explained through simple words and gestures that his family grew corn and raised animals. They had electricity in every room of their house. They had a refrigerator that kept food cold without ice. They had a radio that picked up stations from hundreds of miles away. His sisters went to school for free and could go to college if they wanted. Every Sunday, his mother cooked a dinner almost as big as this Christmas feast. And that was just normal for them, not special at all. Greta looked at the photos of fields full of crops and animals, at the house with glass windows that weren't broken, at the smiling faces of people who looked healthy and strong. While Jimmy's family was growing all this food and living in comfort, Germany had been sending its sons to die in Russia and its daughters to work in factories making weapons. While American farms produced so much food, they could send some to their army to give to prisoners. German children had been eating bread made from sawdust and potato peels. Something inside Greta collapsed at that moment like a building, finally giving up and falling into rubble. Everything she had been taught was a lie. The master race was starving while the soft, weak Americans had more than they could ever use. The great German Reich that would last 1,000 years couldn't keep its own people alive for 12. The enemies they were supposed to hate and fear were the ones showing them the first real kindness they had known in years. That night, Greta sat on her bunk and wrote in the small notebook the Americans had given her. She wrote that they had been fools, all of them. They had believed men in fancy uniforms who gave grand speeches about destiny and greatness, while those same men stole their food and sent their brothers to die for nothing. They had been told that sacrifice and suffering made them strong, but it had only made them weak and hungry and desperate. The Americans hadn't won because they were crueler or more willing to die. They had won because they built things instead of destroying them, because they fed their people instead of starving them, because they treated human beings like they mattered. The camp had started showing films in the recreation hall, newsreels and educational programs. Some of these films showed the concentration camps that the Allies had found: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Greta had heard rumors during the war, whispers about what happened to the Jews and other people the Reich didn't want, but she had told herself the rumors couldn't be true. No civilized nation would do such things. But the film showed the truth in terrible detail: the piles of bodies thin as skeletons, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the ovens built for burning, human beings like trash. Annalise ran out of the hall while the film was playing and threw up behind the building. Helga sat frozen in her seat, tears running down her face, whispering, "No, no," over and over. They had worn the uniform. They had served the regime. They hadn't pulled triggers or opened gas valves, but they had been part of the machine that did these things. The shame felt heavier than anything they could carry. In the weeks after Christmas, everything looked different. The women saw themselves clearly for the first time. They had been so proud of their nation, so sure of their purpose, so convinced they were special. But they had been tools used by evil men for evil purposes. The Americans hadn't just defeated Germany's armies. They had revealed the truth that the Reich had spent 12 years trying to hide, that cruelty isn't strength. That conquest isn't greatness. That treating people like animals makes you less than human yourself. In the spring of 1947, the women finally began going home. The camp that had been their prison and their strange salvation for nearly 2 years was closing down. Germany was ready to take back its people, or as ready as it would ever be. The country was now split into 4 zones controlled by America: Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The future looked uncertain and dark. But at least it was time to see their families again. Greta stood on the train platform, with a small bag containing everything she owned. Inside were some clothes the Americans had given her, a few bars of soap that would be worth a fortune on the black market back home, and a stack of letters tied with string. The letters were from Jimmy, the soldier from Iowa. Over the past year, something had grown between them that neither of them expected. It started with English lessons and shared meals, then became long conversations about life and dreams and the future. He had asked her to marry him 3 months ago, kneeling down right there in the camp recreation hall while other people cheered. She had said yes, crying so hard she could barely speak. Jimmy promised he would do the paperwork, that he would bring her to America as soon as the government allowed it. War bride visas were possible now, though the process was slow and complicated. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck, hidden under her shirt. Some people wouldn't understand. Some people would call her a traitor for loving an enemy soldier. But Greta knew the truth now. The real traitors had been the ones in Berlin who lied to their own people and led them into destruction. Helga was going home too, but her story was different. She had fallen in love with a medic named Robert, who came from Pennsylvania. They had spent months working together in the camp hospital, and he had been so gentle and patient with her, never pushing, always kind. But Robert had been sent back to America 4 months ago, and his letters had stopped coming. Helga didn't know if he had forgotten her, or if his family had convinced him to forget, or if the letters were just lost in the chaos of the postal system. She was going home with hope and fear mixed together in equal measure, not knowing if she would ever see him again. Annalise carried something else entirely. She was 5 months pregnant with the child of an American sergeant who had promised her everything, and then disappeared when his unit shipped out. She wore loose clothes to hide her condition, terrified of what people would say when they found out. An unmarried German woman pregnant with an American soldier's baby would face shame and anger from all sides. But she had decided to keep the child because it was all she had left of a man who had made her feel human again after years of being treated like a cog in a war machine. The train ride back to Germany took 2 days, passing through France and into the American zone. Every mile brought them closer to home and further from the strange safety of the camp. The women watched through the windows as the landscape changed. France showed damage from the war, but also signs of rebuilding. New construction rose among the ruins. People walked the streets with purpose. But when they crossed into Germany, everything looked worse. The cities they passed were still mostly rubble. Stuttgart, Mannheim, Frankfurt, all of them looked like the war had ended yesterday instead of 2 years ago. Mountains of broken concrete and twisted metal stretched as far as they could see. People picked through the ruins looking for anything useful, anything to sell or trade or burn for warmth. Children with hollow eyes and dirty faces watched the train pass. Old women pushed carts loaded with possessions, going somewhere or nowhere, just moving because stopping meant giving up. When Greta's train finally reached Munich, she almost didn't recognize it. Her beautiful city, the place where she had grown up going to concerts and museums and cafes, was gone. The station itself was partially destroyed, with temporary repairs holding up what was left of the roof. She stepped off the train into a crowd of thin, desperate-looking people, all of them searching for someone or something. She found her family living in 2 rooms of a building that was still standing. Her mother looked 20 years older than when Greta had last seen her. Her father's teaching job was gone because he had been a party member, and now the family survived on his mother's sewing work and whatever they could trade. Her younger brother, who had been 12 when she left, was now 15 and looked like a starving old man. They had survived on potatoes and cabbage and whatever they could get on the black market. When they had something to trade, the contrast hit Greta like a physical blow. For 2 years, she had eaten regular meals, slept in a warm bed, worn clean clothes, felt safe. Her family had been digging through ruins and trading family heirlooms for moldy bread. The guilt threatened to crush her. She gave them everything in her bag, the soap, some coffee she had saved, chocolate bars she had been hoarding. Her mother cried when she saw real soap, holding it like it was gold. That first night, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor with her coat as a blanket, listening to her brother cough in the next room, Greta felt the full weight of everything she had learned. The camp hadn't just been better than home. It had been better than anything Germany had offered its people even before the war. The Americans had treated their prisoners better than the Reich had treated its own citizens. That truth sat in her chest like a stone. She showed her family the photos Jimmy had sent her, pictures of his farm and his town and his life. She told them about the marriage proposal, about the visa application, about the possibility of going to America. Her father looked at the photos for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said that she should go if she got the chance. There was nothing left for her here except hunger and ruins and memories of a country that had destroyed itself. If an American soldier wanted to give her a better life, she should take it and never look back. Over the next few months, Greta waited for news about her visa while trying to survive in a city that felt like a graveyard. She found work helping to clear rubble, carrying broken bricks for a few marks a day. She stood in lines for hours to get ration cards that promised food the government didn't have. She watched her neighbors steal from each other, lie to each other, betray each other for a potato or a piece of coal. The nobility and greatness the Reich had promised had become this people, fighting like animals over scraps, while foreign soldiers kept order because Germans couldn't be trusted to govern themselves. She heard stories about Helga through a mutual friend. Robert's letters had finally arrived all at once, a whole stack of them that had been lost in the mail system. He had been writing every week, desperately trying to reach her, thinking she had forgotten him. Now they were working on his paperwork to bring her to America too. It would take time, maybe another year, but it would happen. Anneliese wasn't so lucky. She had given birth to a baby boy in a hospital in Hamburg, and her family had thrown her out. She was living in a displaced persons camp now, one of thousands of German women with American babies, all of them trying to survive the shame and the poverty. Some of them would eventually make it to America. Others would spend years waiting for soldiers who never came back for them. In February 1948, nearly 3 years after her capture, Greta received the letter she had been waiting for. Her visa was approved. Jimmy had arranged everything. She would sail to America in March, and they would be married as soon as she arrived. She held the letter with shaking hands, reading it over and over to make sure it was real. Saying goodbye to her family was the hardest thing she ever did. Her mother held her and told her to go, to live, to be happy, to never come back to this place of death and ashes. Her father gave her his blessing and the last few marks he had saved. Her brother, who barely remembered what peace felt like, asked her to write and tell him what America was really like. The ship to New York took 12 days. Greta stood on the deck as the Statue of Liberty came into view, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. She had been a prisoner of war who found more freedom in a camp than she had ever known in her own country. She had been taught to hate Americans and instead had fallen in love with one. She had believed in a 1,000-year Reich that lasted 12 years and destroyed everything it touched. Jimmy was waiting at the dock, just like he promised. When she saw him, she started running, and he caught her and held her while she cried into his shoulder. He took her hand and led her to his car, a blue Ford that gleamed in the sunlight. As they drove through streets that weren't destroyed, past buildings that stood whole and strong, through a city full of people who looked healthy and fed, Greta understood the final truth. She had learned what real strength looked like. And it wasn't jackboots and rallies and speeches about destiny. Real strength was a country that could feed its people, treat its prisoners with dignity, and build instead of destroy. Real strength was choosing kindness over cruelty, even when cruelty would be easier. Real strength was a farm boy from Iowa who saw a human being instead of an enemy and decided to love her anyway. Years later, living on that Iowa farm she had seen in the photos, with 2 children playing in the yard and a garden growing in the rich soil, Greta would tell her story to anyone who would listen. She would say that she had been captured by the Americans and they had set her free. She would say that losing the war was the best thing that ever happened to Germany because it forced them to see the truth. She would say that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can understand what really matters. The real enemy had never been in Washington or London or Moscow. The real enemy had been in Berlin all along. Men in uniforms who turned a nation's pride into poison and its strength into weakness. The Americans had defeated Germany's armies, but more importantly, they had revealed what Germany had become. And for some women, for prisoners who found unexpected kindness behind wire fences, that revelation had been the beginning of a new life built on truth instead of lies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.